You're listening to the Mike on the Right podcast.
Greetings and welcome. This is the Mike on the Right program. I am your host, Mike Neal. This is episode 17, August 25th, 2025. And as usual, we are broadcasting from the heart of the heartland in central Indiana, the crossroads of America, the great Hoosier State. Thank you so much for listening, for your support. I need you to like, share, subscribe, 5-star ratings, follow anything you can do to continue to grow this show. What you're doing is working. Your support is working. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Before we begin, real quick, I want to do a quick shout out to one of my loyal listeners from the beginning, a founding listener, Chairman John Winkler of the Spencer County Republican Party. I was at their fundraising event, the Perry Spencer Picnic, which is the premier Southern Indiana political event, and he gave me such a fantastic shout out at the event. He shouts me out every year, which is always really wonderful, and this year he gave me a big plug for this show. Thank you so very much for your leadership, for your friendship, and for continuing to keep Mark Warner accountable. And if for those of you who are listening who don't know him, definitely look him up. But thank you so very much. Thank you for the challenge coin. I have a lovely coin that's in my collection box here behind me. Thank you so very much for your friendship, your support, for plugging the show. This is it was a great honor to have that. In this episode, we are going to discuss 3 very important topics that have been going on that you've been hearing back and forth, and all of the rhetoric that I hope to cut through today. The first is how the interest rates being set by the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, how it affects job growth or decline in America. And we're dealing with that right now. There's a lot of questions around that, and we're going to break that down for you. Then we're going to discuss why the U.S. government took a 10% stake in the chip manufacturer Intel. And we're going to discuss, is this type of intervention ever the right thing to do? We're going to discuss that. And finally, we'll talk about the Trump administration's takeover of the D.C. police and the D.C. National Guard to fight crime. And now, of course, it's been announced that they're looking at other cities. Is any of it legal? And should we be doing this as a nation? We're going to talk about all that on this episode. Buckle up. We've got a lot to get to. We're going to start with the Fed. I'm going to start the show with a very definitive statement about our first topic. It's the Fed and Fed policy, not tariffs and immigration, that are affecting the jobs numbers in America and why they are sluggish. We're going to talk about that. Let's begin with some simple truths, however. The job market is slowing. We're starting to see that data. We've been talking about this for a while as a nation. At some point, there has to be a petering out of the job market, even though there continues to be low unemployment, limited layoffs. And the headlines, of course, point fingers at tariffs and immigration policy, but the real culprit, and we're seeing this through the data, is the Federal Reserve's restrictive interest rate stance, which finally sounds like they're going to let up on. And I'm not going to get into the fight between President Trump and Jerome Powell. That is an entirely separate political matter that I don't want to discuss today. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not defending it. I'm not sidestepping it. I only got 30 minutes, and I want to talk specifically about this issue. As conservatives who are free market, free enterprise, we acknowledge that government policy, specifically monetary policy, can easily throttle growth. But also, we know that the Fed is good in certain circumstances at helping cut the interest rates. And so that's what the policy, when you've seen these interest rates grow, the inflation rates. So they use the interest rate to control inflation, which throttles down growth. We're going to talk about that in a second. The job market that we've seen over beginning of this past year is just, And according to the Wall Street Journal, we are starting to see stagnant job market data. Hiring has slowed to a crawl, laying the groundwork for risk if layoffs edge up even modestly. Once you go over the crest of that hill, it is hard to stop, and that is a red flag. And when hiring slows dramatically, a minor uptick in layoffs can spiral into a full downturn. We don't want that. And the key takeaway here is that job growth is signaling caution. It's not collapse yet, but it's enough to worry the Fed. And you heard this in a speech that Jerome Powell just gave in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. We'll get to that in a second. The Fed, let's get a kind of a background here. The Fed has held that in the previous months that it has decided to hold interest rates kind of where it is. There was a big uptick in interest rates. We've had a couple of cuts, and they've held it in this restrictive territory where it is today, citing inflation. Higher rates means it is more expensive to borrow for businesses, for even us, even though that like mortgages, for example, aren't necessarily tied to the interest rate directly as some other borrowing is, but you can kind of see trends. When it goes up, interest rates go up for mortgages. When it goes down, interest rates go down for mortgages. And so, but for businesses, there's even fewer expansions, less investment, and delayed hiring. This type of restrictive policy is meant to slow growth, and there is absolutely a tipping point, and there's this tension, and it seems like the Fed has overplayed their hand. So we also see for consumers, credit card APRs, loan costs, and it shrinks the daily average American's spending power, and it reduces demand because you can't afford things. So we're going to get now to the discussion about what Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, said at the Jackson Hole Conference in Wyoming. He described the labor market as quote-unquote curious, balancing slower labor supply with muted demand. But crucially, he emphasized that even a small shock can trigger layoffs and unemployment, prompting hints towards a rate cut. The Fed knows that risks now lie in a job market teetering on the verge, and they are the number one culprit. They overplayed their hand on these interest rates. Again, say what you will about the fight between Donald Trump and Jerome Powell. The president is making a point that if you continue to drive this too far, you're going to start hurting the fragile economic rebuild that we have been continuing in since COVID. And while the Wall Street Journal acknowledged that tariffs have created uncertainty, the story is clear that hiring was already slowing due to Fed policy and rate pressure, even before tariff concerns took hold. The data looked at that, and there is a strong correlation between hiring and layoffs and Fed policy, because it's more expensive to expand and grow and invest in businesses, small and large, and it hurts the American worker when these companies, it becomes restrictive for these companies to borrow because it's very expensive. Now look, tariffs are certainly a piece of the puzzle, but we have seen time after time in the last 6-8 months, the experts continue to be wrong about the effects of tariffs on the overall market. So the conclusion is that the main reason behind the weak jobs report is because of this restrictive policy. And so what can we do here? Right? The reason that the Federal Reserve is built the way it is so that it does not succumb to political pressures. But we are starting to see damage to the economy, not from the focus on illegal immigration issues, not on tariffs, but on the restriction placed upon businesses for far too long. The true main reason behind the weak jobs report is interest rate policies. And it is time. I'm not saying it has to be dramatic, but we need to start seeing several steps. We should see 2 rate cuts by the end of the year, in my opinion. And we should see more next year in order to allow businesses to expand and grow. They're certainly going to have to watch inflation. They're certainly going to have to watch everything they've been looking at. But at the end of the day, we have a policy that is hurting the American business, which in turn hurts the American worker, which in turn hurts the economy. And we are right at the precipice here. And if this continues, if the Fed does not cut interest rates in September, this upcoming one, I think we're going to start cresting that hill of layoffs, and it's just going to snowball. It is going to snowball, and we're going to have a wrecked economy. And again, no data suggests that it has to do with the illegal immigration crackdown nor tariffs. So I want to throw that out there completely. This is what's going on at the Fed. I wanted to give you an update, and I am hopeful that the President of the United States and the Fed can continue together. Again, there's obviously division in their work. But as the president continues to right-size government and to strengthen the American economy, and the Fed and its policies can line up with where the nation is going, the data says we should. And the Fed, again, the speech by Jerome Powell, he said that it is time to shift policies. Like it is time to get out of this very cautious, now maybe more cautious optimism now, but it was cautious before to the point where it's been hurting us. We have to stop that, and it sounds like that's where we're headed. Next topic I want to discuss is something that I don't really have a full answer to. And the question is the United States government taking a stake in Intel a conservative thing to do? You've probably heard here very recently that the United States government has taken a very rare step in taking a stake in the ownership of an American company called Intel. For those of you not familiar with Intel, they are a chip manufacturer, technology manufacturer in the United States. And on August 22nd, so just not long ago, the United States government acquired just about a 10% equity stake in Intel through a clever conversion of some already committed CHIPS Act grants, which the CHIPS Act was meant to spur manufacturing of those type of chips in the United States, as well as some other program funding, and they've turned them into shares of the company. The deal was priced at just over about almost $20.50, $20.47, totaling almost a $9 billion valuation, paid mostly through these funds that were already obligated to give, and this kind of conversion worked this way. And this raises a central question. Is direct government ownership of private enterprise aligned with conservative free market values, or is it concerning precedent? Now, let's talk about the facts. The government took a stake in Intel without gaining board seats or voting control. So it's a passive investment. The move also removes clawback and performance-based conditions previously attached to the funds, signaling a shift from conditional subsidies to ownership. And the Trump administration, through the Commerce Secretary, emphasized that this is a strategic measure to ensure a return for taxpayers and bolster U.S. leadership in semiconductors. Now, we're going to get into the conversation of whether or not the United States should be stakeholders, the government should be stakeholders in companies. But I do agree that we must, in some fashion, I'm not saying this is it, but we must bolster U.S. leadership in semiconductors. We saw what happened during COVID and chips and that kind of technology. A lot of that is made overseas, most of it made in China. And COVID really screwed us when the whole supply chain across the world shut down and there were things we couldn't get. We can't let that happen again. If there is one thing that we learned from COVID, it should be that we have to manufacture more things like this at home because it is important to the American national security. So is this legal? And more so, is this typical? While rare, this is not entirely without precedent. Historically, the United States government has taken equity stakes during economic emergencies. In the 2008 financial crisis, through the TARP program, it injected capital and took equity in financial institutions, certainly profiting from that, but more so to keep them from failing, which we have this conversation all the time. What is and what isn't too big to fail? And is that something we should even be talking about in America, about being too big to fail? But certainly a collapse of a large financial institution could wreak havoc in the American economy, for the American worker, and for the world. And so take that for how you view it. I'll kind of get to my point here in a second. The government stepped in and took controlling stakes in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to stabilize housing finance. Obviously in the 1930s, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation bought stock in thousands of banks during the Great Depression to try to stabilize that. Auto bailouts in 2009, government acquired substantial ownership in General Motors, almost 60%, to prevent collapse. And there's all kinds of situations where this occurred. Now, again, I'm not saying it's right. I just want to give you kind of the facts. But one of the things that we certainly learned, again, in COVID, was that there are things that we need to be manufacturing here. We need to take that back for our own country's national security and our economy. But in Intel's case, however, this is not a crisis bailout like all the other items that I've spoken about here just a moment ago. It's a proactive industrial policy without emergency, and that is certainly a novel departure, but in the name of national security. So looking at conservative principles, is this an alignment or is this an alarm? Let's look at the pros. If you accept strategic engagement, maybe you don't. But if defending critical U.S. industries like semiconductors is seen as part of national security, one could argue for targeted government investment, especially when used to leverage private sector innovation. The passive nature of this stake with no board control, like in the situation of Intel, suggests limited interference, preserving corporate autonomy. However, the government at any point could sell its stake and certainly could potentially influence things. But that's not the idea that is being portrayed to the American people, at least through what the Trump administration has provided as far as their reasoning for this. And if you're looking for some cons against the conservative and freedom-oriented lens, direct ownership by government and private business runs contrary to the free market orthodoxy and limited government. It blurs the lines. When government becomes a significant shareholder, whether intended or not, this could centralize, undue influence, or distort markets. Historically, bailouts show that stakeholders can get bailout gifts while taxpayers bear the risks. Even if it's not a failure scenario, this precedent can matter. And there are critics, like Barron's, warn that tech challenges like Intel, like failed node rollouts and leadership turnover make ownership less palatable. But no matter what, if the government is going to do this, and I'm not saying I'm for it, I'm still really working through this personally as a conservative. There's so many things that seems like it violates my values, and at the same time bolstering national security through this measure. But regardless of what that looks like, this should be temporary. And I'm not saying it must have an end date, but it should have a targeted end when the government is going to withdraw. The government does not own any more of General Motors. There was an end date, or at least an end goal to get to so that the government would withdraw its stake. We have to have that in this situation, and I'm not sure that it's there yet. So from the historical context, what are the lessons learned? So the TARP bailout that we discussed a little bit ago, there was over $15 billion in profit for taxpayers. So if it is managed well, public entity stakes can work. The RFC investments were largely unwound successfully when the economy recovered, but other interventions that I didn't discuss, like the Continental Illinois Bank, led to $1 billion loss for taxpayers in the 1980s. Long-term control in Fannie and Freddie raised questions about permanent taxpayer exposure and government overreach. And there are, narrow exceptions here that we need to think about. Ownership tends to appear only under dire economic stress, financial crash, war, systemic failure, not during policymaking. So the Intel situation certainly is different, but is national security a qualifier for this type of action? Again, especially with what we learned during COVID. So here's kind of my closing view. This Intel deal is not business as usual for conservatives, and I am conflicted. Normally, I try to end with, here is my opinion, lock, stock, and barrel. I'm conflicted. I lean towards conservative free market principles, but I am not sure that based on what we learned out of COVID, that the government there should be some sort of intervention to bring this type of business to the United States so that we are not enduring the problems and the failures of the supply chain for critical items for the American economy and for American national security. We have to do something. I don't know if this is it. I really am conflicted. But based on that, based on my conservative principles, I don't have an answer for you. But here's what we must ask. Does safeguarding technology and national security warrant this level of government intervention? And more importantly, will this remain a single strategic exception, or is this the beginning of a systemic state intervention into private enterprise? And that's where I certainly would draw the line. If we have one item with an end date, there's certainly more possibility of palleting that. But if we're going to start in 3 or 4 or 5 different industries, I'm not sure that I'm there. And so there's more to come. I don't have an answer for you. There's more to come on this topic, and I look forward to exploring it with you all. Last item that I have for you today is certainly another controversial one. And it's a legal framework discussion over whether the President of the United States should be taking over the D.C. Police and the D.C. National Guard in the name of law and order. And does that authority extend beyond the district? So, what's the history behind this? Just not long ago, a couple weeks ago, the President invoked Section 740 of the Home Rule Act, permitting temporary federal takeover of the District of Columbia Police during emergencies, limited to 30 days unless extended by joint congressional resolution. Also, the D.C. National Guard reports directly to the President and can be deployed under Title 32, which allows state-controlled, federally funded missions. This arrangement does not violate something called the Posse Comitatus Act, which essentially keeps Americans from having the Army act against them, the federal Army. There's a lot more to it, but in those short terms, that the Army, the military, cannot take policing actions against citizens. Now the President is discussing that maybe this thing that he's done in Washington, D.C. is something that can go on to other cities like Chicago, federal deployments in the city of Chicago. And based on the law, it seems to me that there is far more constraint over leaving the District of Columbia. Again, the Posse Comitatus Act restricts use of active duty military in domestic law enforcement unless authorized by law. And then the Insurrection Act of 1807 says that in rare circumstances, permitting federal troops to intervene during rebellions or if a state authority fails to enforce its laws. However, there are some strict prerequisites, and they're seldom used outside of a crisis. So is this crime in D.C.? Well, we got to put D.C. aside because the President clearly has the authority to do it. In cities like Chicago, does he have the authority to do it is the question. And is what's happening in Chicago, or let's go on even further, Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, what these cities, these large cities, is there a crisis? That we've got to determine what that is, what that looks like. Even the title that the President is discussing, Title 10, Section 12406, which he cites allowing the federalization of the National Guard in emergencies, that's kind of his impetus for this. Legal experts agree that deploying troops to a state without a state's consent would face serious legal challenge. However, that does not mean that it is illegal. And so I want to compare the D.C. situation to Chicago and determine whether this is a lawful act or not. In the D.C. case, it is certainly lawful under the Home Rule Act and Title 32. You may not like it. The optics may be bad, and I am not sure how I feel about it. There is certainly, I know that crime has been dropping at a specific a rate. It's not the greatest, it's not the worst, it is dropping. But there is still rampant crime in Washington, D.C. It is at a 30-year low. But just because it's down doesn't mean that there isn't crime. And the President has the authority to do this. So again, you may disagree with the optics, and I'm talking specifically and legally here. The President has the right to do what he's done in D.C. And now I believe there's a deal, so that I think the President has returned the authority back to the local D.C. folks, as long as they're helping in certain circumstances, I believe, with the immigration crackdown and some other things. But that the National Guard is still acting under the President's orders and helping patrol and helping root out the crime that they perceive is an issue. And it is an issue. I think Chicago is certainly more questionable. And I would be interested to know where the authority comes from. But again, when we talk about does Chicago essentially abdicate its authority as discussion in the Insurrection Act? So this is highly questionable to me. Without a request from state leadership or a valid emergency that some say is not valid, any federal troop deployment risks violating the Posse Comitatus Act and infringing on state sovereignty. I am a huge states' rights advocate. Now let's look at some historical precedents beyond D.C. Operation Legend in 2020, federal agents were deployed to cities like Chicago to assist local law enforcement, not with military force, but with the DOJ, FBI, ATF, etc. That was certainly controversial, but legally distinct from military deployments. Earlier, civil rights era interventions like sending troops to Little Rock were backed by Congress under the Enforcement Act as legal exception to posse comitatus. In 2020, Trump's uninvited federal agents in Portland sparked legal backlash. Courts and public officials condemned it as unconstitutional overreach. So I'm posing the question. I'm not making a definitive statement. It seems to me that unless there is a valid crisis, that we shouldn't be deploying National Guard troops to Chicago. But Chicago is certainly under siege internally by gangs and by thugs and by criminals and by drug lords. And the city and the state have not done enough to stop it. That is for sure. So does this align with conservative values? That's what I want to bring to you again today. That this is not really a show with a lot of definitive statements. Does it align with conservative values? If you emphasize law and order and federal authority, yes. Some conservatives support strong response to urban crime, prioritize public safety, and see federal intervention as necessary in perceived local failures. In D.C., actions are technically lawful and may appeal to conservative law and order instincts because it is lawful. In Chicago, it's a question. So does this align with your conservative values? Maybe it doesn't. And if you cherish limited government and local control, deploying troops without state consent clashes with conservative principles like federalism and respect for state and local authority. Political motivations targeting democratically led cities, majority-minority cities, raise questions, serious concerns about fairness and constitutional overreach. There's a big question here. And so here's my closing thought about this. This isn't just about law enforcement. It is certainly a test of principles. Law and order absolutely matters. We back the blue, we back our troops, we back law and order regardless of gender or race or socioeconomic status or position in whatever it is you do. I believe that nobody is above the law. The law, however, must be administered equally to everyone, which we have problems with that sometimes in America. But again, this is a test of principles. And so, yes, law and order matters, but so do federalism and constitutional limits. The distinctions between D.C.'s unique status and deploying troops to the city of Chicago, for example, is where the conservative reckoning lies. I believe the president certainly has the authority in D.C., but the jury is still out in other cities other than D.C. I am withholding judgment as far as to whether it is legal or not. I don't know if Chicago is at a point where we need this type of intervention. I just don't know that. But I will concede this, that I believe the state and local authorities have abdicated their responsibility on public safety. I believe that Democrats in these large cities have attacked police, have attacked law and order, and some of them tried to defund the police, and then it all got worse, and they all tried to throw money back in, like Minneapolis. And they've paid for that. People have paid for that. We see what's going on in Indianapolis. Downtown Indianapolis is not always safe. I don't care what anybody says. There are all types of other places around the city that aren't safe either. So something has to be done. I just don't know what the answer is. And I leave that for you today. This is not a show with a lot of answers today. I usually have pretty definitive statements, like I said. And so as I close this, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your support. I ask that you like and share and follow, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating wherever you are. And certainly this week, as I post clips to Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter/X and YouTube, please engage in the conversation. I want to hear more about this. I want to have discussion hopefully a good discussion this week about this and what conservatives really feel about all of these topics, from the Intel piece to the DC Chicago issue. I hope that you'll engage civilly in discussion. Have a great week.